So before we dive into too much, I wanted to talk kind of about the end of quarter and a little bit of my plans for the end of quarter. We have our second to last assignment due tonight. Pending time in my office, my plan is to reveal the last assignment due in 2 weeks and the last project, the LL parsing project today. So that's what I will be prioritizing when I get back to my office. I will, considering we probably have 2-ish days of content left in the course with the original material that was planned, my goal for next week is to do a lot of preparing people for exam 3. So I'll be revealing a study guide by Friday. I have some practice problems for us to work on as part of that studying for exam 3. So we'll take a day or two and work on those practice problems. We'll have a regular review where people can ask whatever they want with regards to exam 3, but I plan to just take things a lot slower and spend a lot more time really preparing people to do well on these last couple of exams. As there's interest, I can research and come up with some content for some areas of interest within the course. So if you have some of those, go ahead and just send me an email and I will do what I can to dig in and find some content or come up with something we could do in class. Maybe we'll take a day where we can work on some of the projects and just ask me questions as you go. Maybe we can outline a design for one of the projects, something like that. Make it as easy as possible to interface with the end of the quarter.
I don't believe that the exam 2 is posted on or revealed on campus.
Is what is?
Exam 2.
Exam 2 not in yet. Yeah, I need to go get those at campus. I need to do the times 1.2 and then and then reveal it all so that people know what the actual value is. Yeah, I have not had time for that either. Other questions or concerns before we dive into a little bit of the last bit of content? Okay. So we ended last class talking about, we spent some of last class talking about LL1 parsing and coming up with an LL1 table. Then we got the example of what happens if a grammar is not LL1, what would an LL2 grammar look like? So we looked at, I'm going one ahead. We looked at, really? Where's the LL2 one? It's here somewhere. Wasn't that? I guess the one after this. Yeah, it's here. Okay. So we use this grammar to say, one, build the LL1 parse table. We did this by calculating first of S and follow of S and found that the table looked like this. There was some ambiguity in the table when we're trying to derive a string that starts with A from the non-terminal S. We found that there were 2 productions that we could apply where a string could start with A. So a look ahead of 1 was not good enough. We needed to use a look ahead of 2. So to build an LL2 parse table, the only thing that changed was we're looking at sequences of 2 characters in the columns rather than just 1 character. So we built a table that looked more like this, where these were all of the pairs of terminals that could appear. So AA, AB, A followed by the end of string marker, BA, BB, B end of string, or just end of string. One of the frequent mistakes I see is that you try to do dollar something and or dollar dollar, and that just means that it has no meaning. End of string is end of string. Nothing can come after the end of the string. So we still need to consider it, but if you end the string immediately, we don't need to look ahead 2 characters. It ends here, now. But with this grammar, we can only produce strings that start with AA or AB. By filling out this LL2 table, we were actually able to show that with a look ahead of 2 characters, we could distinguish which of these productions to use. I hinted throughout this process that some grammars are not LLK for any K. But let's take a look at this and see what would happen if we tried to build an LL table for this. So let's start with just thinking about intuitively or logically deriving how many characters ahead would you have to look to be able to know the difference. So assuming that we are at S and we want to know whether we are going to use A capital B or AA capital C, how far ahead in the string would we have to look where we are 100% sure that the correct production is A capital B, or the correct production is AA capital C? Yeah,
Would it be 3?
let's see if we can come up with that. So how do you get 3?
I just said 3 just because for S to AAC and then from C to ABC that we have to look. Oh, actually, never mind. It'll probably just be 2 because we can already see the A and then read in the B and the C, or vice versa. We can already see that first A and S and then read in the AC.
Okay, I like that. So the question is really just how many A's are there at the front of this before we see our first B? Because we see that S can't go back to S. So the question is either are we going to B or are we going to C? To go to B immediately, we could read an arbitrary number of A's. Getting to B and looping, recursing from B to B to B to B, we could produce some number of A's. Doesn't matter, arbitrary number. But if we go to C, we get 2 of them for sure before we go there, and then we get 1 of them for sure after we get there. So we might need to look ahead far enough to determine where is that next character. Maybe we see AAAB. Does that guarantee whether we went to B or to C? So let's try to figure this out. Number of look-aheads needed to determine which rule to apply. For C, we can't use a single look-ahead. Both of the productions start with A, but afterwards, a 2-character look-ahead solves the problem. You see $, and it's the second production. You see AB, and it's the first production. So K is 2 for the production for the non-terminal C. We see a C, and from there, we need 2 characters to know which production to apply. For B, rules start with a different terminal. Easy. Look ahead of a single character. If it's an A, apply A capital B. If we just see AB, then we apply the rule BC. For S, a little bit harder. Longest string you can make that's shared in common, starting with either production. So here is the answer. You can generate AAAB from either the left-hand side or the right-hand, I shouldn't say that, the first production or the second production on the right-hand side of S. So we needed 5 characters to distinguish between the productions. So that tells us that this grammar is LL5. Since the maximum between all of the productions, the most look ahead that we needed in order to be able to resolve a non-terminal was 5 characters. Which means that if you were to produce an LL table for this, there would be enough columns for every possible sequence of 5 characters. Given that the terminals here are A and B and C and $, how many is that? Quick combinatorics problem. So what can the first character be? If we're trying to build a string of size 5, first character could be A or B or C or technically $, but since $, isn't going to follow with some more stuff, I'm going to handle $, separately as a separate problem. What could the second character be? A or B or C. Three of the fifth possibilities there. So dollar could appear here for sure. And that's can be incorporated within this. So we can get all the way to here and then get this. So this is an extra 3 to the 4th times 4. Let's actually break it up. What happens if dollar is here? We get 3 to the 3rd times 4. What happens if dollar is here? So that would be the number of columns in your LL table. Anyone want to run that through a calculator and tell me what that is at the top of there? Oh, something.
So laying it down, let's 3 to the 5th plus 4 times. Plus, okay, so 3 to the 5th plus 4 times.
This
3
is
to the
4
10th
times, so this is,
Plus that, but technically, plus you. Technically, I think you can group the 4, it's 3 to the X, and then you could just do it as 4 times.
you can tell it's bad when computer scientists don't immediately go to a calculator. It's like, what is a calculator? We don't use those in class. Someone has me here. Someone have my back. This is how you burn time in class, by the way. You ask a combinatorics question to computer scientists. Terrible joke. I'll eventually get an answer.
Working on it.
I appreciate you, Riley.
724.
724. A 724 column table with 3 rows. So we're gonna have a nice, fun, what is that? 2,172 cells. I can do that. That's fun. I don't think we really want to do that though. So you can see that grammars become a little bit more work when it's not LL1 or LL2, but it's still better sometimes than CYK. It probably wouldn't be in this case. CYK would be fewer operations than 2,100 for this grammar, but I don't know if it would be if we turn this into Chomsky and tried to work with a string that was reasonably long. So this is nice. You can, with this much pre-processing, you can turn this into a linear time operation where you can now determine with a 5-character look ahead, once you fill in all 2,172 cells, where we are. Question on that? Questions on what an LL grammar looks like that's not LL2? This one was LL5. Fun combinatorics distraction, but then again, I like that, so. All right, example 3. Here's another grammar, LLK for what value of K?
For the last one, would the K have to be 5?
Yeah.
So it just goes to the highest value.
Yeah, for all non-terminals, it goes to the highest value that you would need to evaluate any particular non-terminal. Yeah. Yeah. What do we think? Anyone have a guess? How far out do we need to look? Gosh, I'm dating myself. Who says far out anymore? How far out do we have to look in order to be able to distinguish between which production to apply?
Say three again, because S only ends with B and S only ends. It either ends in a B or a C, so then we'd be able to find it out pretty quickly.
S can also start with a B though, because A can just go straight to lambda, so we can skip over it.
Could, but now the question is, what is the longest string that you can make? We're not asking about the shortest string. We could very easily come up with a one character differentiator for two particular strings. But what is the longest string we could generate?
But are we looking for ambiguity?
Yeah,
So then wouldn't we be able to tell that there's no ambiguity because?
so imagine
I guess
that,
that's more, 'cause once we get to A, then it's.
let's generate a string with 6 A's at the beginning, something else. Is there a way to generate this from both of these productions?
Yeah.
Yes. Is there a way to generate a 7th A?
Yeah.
8th A?
Yes.
Millionth A?
Yes.
Billionth A? Is there an upper bound to this? No. So this is an example of what an LL would look like with no K, where no such K exists. Let's get there. Even just looking at A. First two productions can generate an infinite number of A's. So there is no length of a look ahead that could distinguish between we need to pick this or we need to pick this. And note that because there's this dangling A at the end, that there's no way to see really. We don't know which production to apply because let's say we needed to generate exactly 1 million A's. There's no way to distinguish that I should pick this one and recurse it some number of times, or this one and recurse it one fewer or half the number of times, recursing in the middle. There's no way to know that with that look ahead. So it's impossible to figure this out. No value of K can distinguish between the productions. So our conclusion is just grammar is not LLK for any K. And this means that we can't use an LL table to speed this up. We would have to default back to CYK to be able to see whether a string can be produced by this grammar or not. Usually this means that there are branches that converge back on themselves in some way, shape, or form. So there are multiple ways to generate that string in the grammar, which means that it's ambiguous. This grammar is certainly ambiguous. All right, that's basically the end of LL. At this point, I feel confident in people's ability to go make first tables, follow tables, LL tables, referring to those first and follow tables, and to implement the LL algorithm. How do we feel about that? Do we feel like with the reveal of an assignment, we'd be good to go? Got to go do it to make sure. Do you feel confident enough to get started? Obviously, I'll be here to support you through that process, so you can come to me with questions. We'll do a little bit of it in class. But let's move on to the last topic. Last topic I have prepared, LR parsing, which is quite significantly more challenging than LL parsing. Because why not? But we saw scenarios where there were grammars that were not LLK for any K, which means we can't use the LL algorithm on it, which is kind of sad. But I said that we could go use CYK, which would be great. Wouldn't it be nice if there was something else we could do? And it turns out that sometimes there is something else we can do, which is check whether it's an LR of K grammar. So LR grammars are more complicated than LL grammars, but there are more context-free grammars that are LR than are LL. And this means that if you understand both LL and LR, you can use LL, the easier algorithm, whenever a grammar is LLK. You can still speed up from CYK to get LR when a grammar is LR but not LL. And you'll still be able to default to CYK if a grammar is not LR of K. So just like we did with LL, we're going to model a transformation of a context-free grammar to a non-deterministic pushdown automata following the LR parsing algorithm. So refreshing us on exactly what we did for LL, we said there were two types of productions. There were those that replaced a non-terminal with its right-hand side, both terminals and non-terminals on the stack. And then there were shifts. We could pop a terminal off the stack and move past the terminal in the input string. This was a top-down algorithm. We started with the start non-terminal, and the goal was to build and look at the string character by character. I suggested early on that LR was a bottom-up algorithm, and we talked about what bottom-up looked like. Who can recall what bottom-up was? How can you guess that we're going to be tackling this problem if it's bottom-up?
We're going from the end of the string and trying to reduce everything back to the start.
Yes. So we're going to start with the string and try to make intelligent substitutions for non-terminals based on some patterns that we see in the string and mapping those to right-hand sides of productions so that we can convert them into their associated left-hand side form with the goal of trying to convert the end string all the way down into the start non-terminal. So another way to construct an NPDA that models this process. 3 states just like before, an initial state Q0, a final state Q2. We have Q0 now being the state with the most transitions instead of Q1. Instead of pushing the start non-terminal on and then manipulating it, we're going to do everything that we can in Q0. For every production where we have some non-terminal on the left-hand side and our sequence of terminals and non-terminals representing the production, we will add a transition rule where we say from Q0, popping nothing and pushing the sequence of characters that are on the right-hand side, that will transition to Q0 with that left-hand side on the stack. So we're basically, with no move in the input. We're going to pop all of those and push just the A. How are we going to do that? We can't do a multi-pop. We're calling this a reduction, and we're going to model this reduction in a certain form. So it's going to be a huge challenge to figure out how to do this multi-pop. We want to take all of that off and replace it with this. For each terminal and each stack symbol, we will do this transition. From Q0 on the terminal, on the stack symbol, we will make a transition back to Q0, and we will concatenate that terminal and stack symbol. So now what we have is the ability to have strings on the stack that represent multiple characters, rather than each character being a separate element of the stack. We're going to call this a shift. So reductions and shifts are the two kinds of transitions that we need to make sure that we have on our NPDA. From Q0 to Q0, every possible reduction, every possible shift. 2 final transitions moving from Q0 to Q1. We need to see and remove the start non-terminal from the top of the stack. So there's the transition for that. And to move from Q1 to Q2, the stack now must be empty. So we can't have found a way to get the start non-terminal, but there was some other stuff beneath it that says that we didn't really get there. maybe just the end of the string happened to be a legal string in that language where we could reduce that down into the start non-terminal, but there was some other stuff there as well. So that's it. That's the entire process. Let's give you an example. We'll use the same grammar that we used before. So we're getting very familiar with this grammar. So 3 states, the initial state Q0, Q1, final state Q2, and the reduction rules are going to now, when we see the right-hand side, the string that is the right-hand side, we can replace it with the left-hand side. So if we see the string ASB, we can replace that with an S. We see A, we can replace it with S. So we're going from right-hand side to left-hand side. Just like before, we went from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, except that we did it as symbol by symbol, and now we're doing it as concatenating it into a string so that we don't have to worry about this multi-pop. We'll introduce that concept when we come up with the entirety of the LR state machine, which is really fun, but kind of tough. Shift transition rules. We're going to say that from Q0, we can go back to Q0. If we pop an A followed by something, then we can shift past that in the input. For any possible next character in the string, we can shift past it. So X can be a terminal, non-terminal, or even the bottom of stack character. Then we'll add the final transition rules, and we get something that looks like this. Replacing right-hand sides with left-hand sides on the top, shifts on the bottom. So we read an A, you want to be able to pop any given symbol or move past that symbol and pop the A and that symbol from the stack. Questions on this so far?
What's that? Notation on the bottom right.
For all X in the terminals and the non-terminals, the book calls B variables, what we're calling non-terminals, union the bottom of stack character. So for all X that are in the terminals, non-terminals, and bottom of stack symbol. Let's give an example run through. So we first want to shift the symbols from the string onto the stack. So taking the input string, we shift them onto the stack using those shift rules. When it's appropriate to do so, we'll pop a right-hand side off the stack and replace it with a left-hand side. So somehow reducing. Basically, we're taking characters from the string, putting them in, combining them into those, and then ending up with a start non-terminal. So unfortunately, these last 2 steps are non-deterministic. Sometimes we can either choose a shift or a reduction, and we don't know which one to do. They'll both be legal. So we have to non-deterministically choose whichever one happens to be right. And the goal of building an LR table will be to remove that non-determinism and know for sure which rule to apply. So we need additional information, which will look somewhat familiar, to turn this non-determinism into a deterministic algorithm. We'll store a look ahead, just like before. If this is an LR1 grammar, we'll only need a look ahead of size 1. If it's an LR3, we'll need a look ahead of size 3. Maybe it's not possible to come up with a look ahead. This isn't an LR grammar for any K. Let's give you an example parse. So same grammar, same string that we did for the LL parse. Let's trace what happens. I will give you a note here that we had non-determinism at steps 5 and 7 in this, but let's take a look at and explain everything that's going on here. So we first, given that this is the string, we're gonna shift on the A. We're going to shift on the B. We're going to shift on the C. So now we have this C that can be replaced with an A. Note that here is that step 5 where non-determinism was possible, where we could have, we did a reduction here, when we could have done an additional shift, shifting on the A here. How did we know which one to do? We forked the process and found the one that terminated. And this is the one that terminated. We didn't know when we did this. We had to search deterministically. So the operation here tells you whether it's a shift S or a reduction R. The look ahead tells us where we are in the string. So the look ahead says how much of the string has been added to the stack. When we shift on the A, we've handled the A. When we shift on the B, we've handled the B. When we shift on the C, we've handled the C. The look ahead is now the A. We can reduce this C into a capital A. We can somehow now dig down the stack far enough to be able to find that the next 3 things down the stack map to the right-hand side. We need to store some information as we do this in order to be able to make that claim or to know that we can do that. Since we can't do this multi-pop, we need some additional storage to know what's going on here. And also to know that this is going to be finite. So how this is actually done is really cool. But for now, think of it as magic. We're digging down multiple places in the stack. We see that the top 3 elements of the stack map to a left-hand side. This B capital AA is this B capital AA. So we can reduce. We get to this capital A. We can reduce the capital A to an S. This is why we need that double transition where we move taking off the S, because we found this S, but this is not great when you could just now transition to Q1, transition to Q2. The stack's not empty. This isn't the bottom of stack character. This is an A, which says we haven't parsed the whole string. Even though we were able to reduce this down into a capital S, and at that being at the top of the stack, that doesn't mean that this is in the language. The stack would have to be empty. So we shift again. Sorry, we shifted here, so I should have moved past this A when I put this A on the stack. Now we can shift the B on the stack. Everything is now on the stack, where we can now reduce, taking this A capital SB, reducing that down into the S. We now see that we're able to transition from Q0 to Q1, removing the S, Q1 to Q2, either keeping the bottom stack symbol on there or removing it, depending on, the book is really inconsistent with whether they keep the bottom of stack symbol on or take it off, which is why I don't care what you do. They leave it on here. It's okay if you take it off as well. But the idea is you accept if the stack is either empty or just has that bottom of stack character from Q2. Questions on what this process does? Aside from the magic that it does to dig that far down the stack? That is the big intellectual problem we will have to solve in order to be able to do this at a reasonable complexity.
I think I understand all of it, but the step 6, when you push the A onto the stack above the
Yeah.
capital,
Yeah,
how did you know to do that? I guess.
so there's no B cap, there's no capital A.
Yeah.
I guess this capital A could become a capital S. So this step 5 is ambiguous. This is the, yeah, we could have done either one of those at that point. We had to use non-determinism, and whichever process terminated with an accept, that's the one that was displayed. But there was another process that shifted on top of that, never found a match for a right-hand side and rejected. Great question.
Also, if you did from the capital A to an S, the ASB would just turn to S right away.
Yeah,
It would like kind of skip a step.
well, keep in mind we go from bottom to top. So this would be B capital S A, and there is no right-hand side that is B capital S A. When we do the ASB, it's from bottom to top here.
Oh, I see.
Other questions? All right, let's come up with the intuition to do what we need to do to be able to dig this far down in the stack. We'll need 2 more definitions, items and closure, to be able to do this. So first point, we can map this to, we need to know when some right-hand side is on top of the stack, but there is no way to easily know that without storing it as a larger string. If you try to store it as a larger string, we have to use non-determinism to know how big each of those are. That's going to get impossible to turn into a deterministic process, because we need to turn this into a deterministic process if we want it to be useful in a deterministic compiler. So each symbol from the right-hand side put on the stack one at a time. We need to somehow keep track of the symbols that are on the stack and the symbols that aren't on the stack. So to do this, we're going to add a marker to the right-hand side of each production. So if we look at a grammar, there's going to be some position in each of these that tell us what of this production is currently on the top of the stack. And that will get manipulated as we do a shift or a reduce. So each marker tells us how much of something is there so that we know whether we can reduce it or not. So we use this concept of a dot to tell us how much of it is currently on the stack. Symbols to the left of it are on top of the stack. Symbols on the right of it are not. So as we continue to shift, as we continue to reduce, we find ways now to manipulate this marker in each production as we do every single step of this process. So marker can appear anywhere in the production. If it's at the very beginning, that says we haven't matched anything. We need to see the entire production in order to be able to reduce. At the very end, a reduction is possible. It's one of the things that we could choose to do right now because we know that everything from that production is currently on the stack. Questions on that? Concept of a marker within the right-hand side of a production? Being able to think about the complexity of this, we have right-hand sides with n symbols, then there are n+1 possible positions for the marker. Makes sense, can either be at the beginning, at the end, or anywhere in between. That's n+1, where n is the length of the string. Let's say that the marker is immediately to the left of a non-terminal. We know that that non-terminal is not on the stack. So maybe we have something like s arrow a dot sb. This would say that the A is on top of the stack and the S is not. So it would be nice if we could get a reduce to be able to move this past this S, because then the S would be on top of the stack. To be able to move the marker right, we need all of the elements on the right-hand side to be on the stack for some production based on that non-terminal. So maybe we do have something like A arrow, I don't know, A, B, A, something like this. We need there to be some production, B arrow something, with a dot at the end of it to be able to reduce this, get the B on the stack so we can move this dot past here. Does that make sense how the interrelation would work between being on the dot in this production, being on the right-hand side, the left-hand side of a non-terminal, and then having to map to the dot being at the very end of this production. Very end of this production, we can reduce all of this to a B, then move past this, having that B now being on top of the stack. So that's what it would take to move this dot forward one place. So given that we have a context-free grammar, we're going to define closure as a set of items as such. This set is going to have a single element, A arrow W dot V. So the closure of W dot V is defined to be all such productions such that there's a left-hand side arrow. It's possible to have that W on the left and that V on the right with a dot in the middle of it. So how we are going to add elements to this set is we're going to loop saying for every production in the set, if a dot appears before a non-terminal, add a new production to the set. B arrow dots the entire right-hand side for every possible right-hand side. Let's give you an example of that. And I think that just talking about the algorithm is just a bunch of words. So calculate the closure of S arrow A dot SB for this grammar. We start by defining the closure in terms of itself. So we add itself to the closure. We know the marker is to the left of a non-terminal, so we add both S productions to the marker to the left of their right-hand sides. So this just says that we took this production, added it to the closure with the dot on the left-hand side. We took this production, added it with the dot to the left-hand side. You can imagine now that what this tells you is in order to get this past this S, we could find either this sequence on top of the stack or this sequence on top of the stack. If either of these are on top of the stack, we can reduce to S and move forward within this closure. So this is a way of storing all of the relevant ways that we could reduce, move forward. Does this make sense? Starting to get into the weeds a little bit.
You'd only have to make closures for productions that have non-terminals in them.
It's the way that we're doing this for this particular closure. We'll talk about the exact algorithm here in a moment. It's a good point though. What are the relevant closures to this problem? So last element in the set is now to the left of a new non-terminal. So now we're going to loop through this and add every A to this with the marker on the left of their right-hand sides. Because now, if we can evaluate this A to be an S, if we could shift this to be an A, we could shift that to be an, reduce this to be an A, we could reduce that to be an S. So we need to loop this for every possible non-terminal this could start with. So we're going to do that. Now we look at the two possible right-hand sides and add those, that we can get A arrow, BAC, and C with, again, that marker on the far left-hand side. No elements were added that had non-terminals on that far left-hand side, so we terminate. This closure is now complete. This tells us, basically, if we ever see an element of a stack where the top of it is something like BAC, we know that that is something where this marker would be here. We can reduce that to be an A. We can reduce that A into an S. And we can now shift this one. So we talked about how these are reductions. This is going to be a shift that moves forward past a non-terminal. So we see this, we move there, we see this, we move there. We can now move this forward one. All right, is there a marker to the left of an S in an item? So example like this. So A is on the stack, S and B not yet on the stack. If we shift and we could place an A, so some shift operation placed that A on the stack. We know that that had to happen to shift the A from the input string onto the stack. To get the S on the stack, we have to reduce some production down to an S. All symbols on the right-hand side of some S arrow right-hand side has to be on the stack first, kind of as I just drew on the last slide. And we find that eventually everything is on the stack for some element of that closure. We reduce down to the S so that we can move past the S with this marker in this closure, creating yet another closure that we might need to handle in some capacity. Luckily for this, there's no non-terminal on the right-hand side, so it would take a shift of a B in order to be able to reduce down to that S now. I feel like we need a breather from this. We've been at this for a while. We are luckily just about at the end of class, so I think we'll pause it here and come back for the rest of the LR parsing algorithm tomorrow. And starting on Friday, we'll start shifting our focus, no pun intended, toward getting ready for exams, working on projects, getting some practice problems. I tried to make this as exciting as possible. Hopefully it wasn't completely dry. Hard to make this exciting.